There's an old saying that no art exists in a vacuum, and that's true. Stuff like Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, Silent Hill all took inspiration from Resident Evil in the 1990s, which ideally was the time to do that. Game development back then was cheaper and faster. Companies could turn out games year after year. Even if a game flopped, it wouldn't be the end of your studio in most cases. While Square was in the early development stages of 16, Game of Thrones was around season 5 to season 6. Jon Snow had just died and been resurrected, and it seemed as if the show was heading to a climactic and satisfying ending. And to Square's defense, they couldn't have predicted season 8. I surely didn't. So Final Fantasy meets Game of Thrones was probably a good idea in hindsight. And if 16 existed in a world where it came out in 2017, it might be looked at differently, but that's not what happened. One of the things 16 had going against itself is that it released in an industry with much more competition, and Game of Thrones was not this big cultural giant it used to be. Say whatever you want about previous Final Fantasy games like 15, 13, 12, and so on, but they gave me an experience I can't get anywhere else. If I want a pure action game, I can just go play Devil May Cry 5 or Bayonetta 3. If I want an in-depth RPG game, I'm not lacking for that department because I got Baldur's Gate 3 or Cyberpunk. If I want an action RPG, Square has 7 Remake, Kingdom Hearts, Neo The World Ends With You, and also again, there's Witcher 3. So the question becomes, what does 16 do that fills a void that I'm missing? The best thing I can say is that the spectacle is great, but spectacle only lasts so long. I would never say that my time playing the game was bad because I did enjoy it for what it was, but I am left wanting a little more, especially in regards to its characters. Benedicta probably being the biggest victim of this in my opinion. Everything about her design and character had me interested in how she would turn out. She had a history with Cid, and I was hoping to see that their relationship would be explored further. Would her loyalty lie with Barnabas, Cid, Hugo, or would she just carve her own path? Well, none of those questions are answered because my girl is fridged in like the first 5 hours or something. So the main thing that I'm getting at here is that 16 wears this veil of maturity, but it's caught between this almost impossible juggling act. It wants to provide moral complexity, but the thing about moral complexity is that it requires empathy and time. And 16 is not a short game. I put around 40 hours into it, but I can say that after my 40 hours, I really feel like I don't know these people outside of Clive, Cid, and maybe Jill. And the thing that puzzles me the most is that Final Fantasy 16 had a game it could take direct inspiration from. There's a lot I can say about this game, and someday I might, but for now, just know that Final Fantasy Tactics is my favorite Final Fantasy game, and one of those reasons why is because, like Game of Thrones, its development is inspired by the life experiences of the people who made it. Yasumi Matsuno had made games like Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre, and those games dealt with the human cost behind war. But the thing that makes Final Fantasy Tactics so special is that Matsuno stated that the game's thematic use of class-based society was derived from his experiences working with game production companies. He saw how senior designers were treated as royalty, and if I had to guess, Matsuno was probably disillusioned with aspects of game development, and that poured into our main character, Ramza Bayov. Ramza was born into nobility, but after seeing how nobility treats common people, he became estranged from his family, going so far as to take his mother's last name. He fights for the common good, even at the personal cost to himself. I won't give a full summary of Tactics because it's definitely a game that should be played, but it's a fascinating tale of ethics, morality, and the cost of doing the right thing in a world that continually ensures that is nearly impossible. And that is my gold standard for a Final Fantasy game. A Song of Ice and Fire is interesting because it blended the micro with the macro. Basically, these small little things between people could have these giant political implications. A Game of Thrones wasn't written as a simple Lord of the Rings copy. It's not even Martin's first book, it's his 5th book. And the thing about Martin is that in the 1960s, he objected to the Vietnam War, and his experiences throughout that era shaped how he approaches conflict and stories. That's why so much of Game of Thrones feels real, because it feels like it was informed by a person and not just cynically made to sell books or sell video games. His philosophy is the same as William Faulkner, which is the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. In essence, you can have your story about dragons, gods, giant robots, but it can't be about those things. It has to be about the people in the story. And that's what made A Song of Ice and Fire so special. It's something 16 doesn't really understand, and even House of the Dragon, if I'm being honest. My favorite scene in all the Game of Thrones TV show is probably Robert reflecting on his marriage with Cersei, the two of them having an open and honest conversation, and Cersei realizing that there was never a chance for her and Robert to really love each other.
So here we sit, 17 years later, holding it all together. Don't you get tired?
Every day.
How long can hate hold a thing together?
Well, 17 years is quite a long time.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. What was she like?
You've never asked about her, not once. Why not?
At first, just saying her name, even in private, I felt like I was breathing life back into her. I thought if I didn't talk about her, she'd just fade away for you. When I realized that wasn't going to happen, I refused to ask out of spite. I didn't want to give you the satisfaction of thinking I cared enough to ask. And eventually it became clear that my spite didn't mean anything to you. As far as I could tell, you actually enjoyed it.
So why now?
What harm could Lyanna Stark's ghost do to either of us that we haven't done to each other 100 times over?
You want to know the horrible truth? I can't even remember what she looked like. I only know she was the one thing I ever wanted. Someone took her away from me, and 7 kingdoms couldn't fill the hole she left behind.
I felt something for you once, you know.
I know.
Even after we lost our first boy. For quite a while, actually. Was it ever possible for us? Was there ever a time, ever a moment?
No. Does that make you feel better or worse?
Doesn't make me feel anything.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't really know what's going to be next for Final Fantasy, but now that 16 is out on both PlayStation and PC, we need more authentic games. Final Fantasy built its own lane, and it seems as if Square isn't comfortable with that. And on some level, I can kind of get it. Having a series that was once the biggest name in RPGs next to Pokemon, but it's not even barely moving the needle nowadays, isn't something easy to cope with, especially since game development isn't getting any cheaper. And if you're an old head like me, you probably remember when a Final Fantasy game would be one of the biggest releases of the generation. And Square probably saw how Sony could switch up God of War and that become even more successful. But the circumstances for what made God of War 2018 a success doesn't really translate to Final Fantasy. And if Square wants Final Fantasy to be a mainstay again, they'll need to do that by making the series more of itself and not like something else. Just as the saying goes, a game made for everyone is a game for no one.